Thank you for taking this time to listen to this webinar. This is a webinar to think about helping children with their school experiences and to give some ideas about what to look for when choosing a school for your child or working with your child's current school.
So why do adopted children need attachment and trauma-informed provision? When children come to be adopted, 100% of them have experienced a traumatic loss at a key developmental stage. Even children adopted at birth have experienced the loss of the person that they were born to. As you can see from the statistics here, there are so many adverse childhood experiences, including those pre-birth experiences that the children may have had, that we know can have a long-term impact. In 2015, 75% of babies were exposed to alcohol in the womb. This may have increased now. 74% experienced abuse and neglect within the birth families before they were brought into the care system. A quote from 2013, and the average age of entering the care system is 2.5 years. So that's 30 months plus their pre-birth experience of abuse, neglect, potential witnessing domestic violence, potential multiple carers, all impacting on their rapidly developing brains. Only 0.3% of our children have had one stable foster placement. So if you think that between birth and 2.5 years, most of us wouldn't move at all, but so many of our children have had multiple moves at that time when their brains can't make any logical sense of what is going on. And of course, there are other children who never come into the care system who are also affected by separation and loss and trauma.
What can then happen as a consequence of those experiences is developmental or complex trauma, and the disruption that this causes to the neurological, cognitive and psychological development, and this can then impact on that capacity to learn and settle and be available to the kind of experiences of school and education provided in the UK. It can also lead to attachment difficulties and disorders, which again impacts on school. And if school doesn't have a good understanding of these difficulties and the way they overlap, it can lead to a difficult and frustrating experience for all involved, as Julia Selwyn noted in her 2014 research.
The way we learn is dependent on how our brain develops in response to our early experiences. So it's important for educators to have an understanding of the long-term impact of those experiences on our brain development. Generally, we're all born with a similar kind of brain hardware in that there are millions and millions of neurons waiting to make connections in a single brain. But in every single brain, the connections that are made between those neurons are completely user-specific. Each brain is unique to its owner. For children who have attuned and available and thoughtful carers, they're going to get lots of synapse connections, lots of those juicy interventions that make the brains richer and fatter and more able to be curious about all sorts of things. The things that a brain is exposed to create a brain's interest in and understanding of the world. Equally, for children who are neglected, they have less rich pathways being laid down. They are not as exposed to as much input, and much of the input that they do receive means that they are much more preoccupied with staying safe and alive. So they are less able to think about things beyond that because the world is just not as safe for them. We learn to manage our stresses by the way people respond to our stress in infancy. If somebody picks us up and soothes us and holds us, then our bodies learn through the experiences of their bodies how you calm yourself, how you reduce stress, how you manage that uncomfortable experience. If somebody grabs you and shouts at you or just doesn't come to tend to you at all, then your capacity to understand how to respond to stress is less because you haven't had those kind of experiences. And actually, if you don't have an experience of somebody soothing your stress, then your brain stays in a stressed state for much longer. So its capacity to be available for other things is that much less because it's much more likely to be in that high alert stress state. The really good news is that since the development of brain scans, etc., we know so much more about the brain and that it has much more plasticity and capacity for growth and change, as our brains carry on growing until we're in our mid-20s. And even then you can still learn to change, but the actual growth and development of the brain continues well into young adulthood. There's a very good YouTube video that the NSPCC brought out some years ago, which is called Growing an Emotional Brain, which might be helpful for sharing with schools.
When you're thinking about your child and school and where you might want them to go, it's worth thinking about some of the experiences of adopters who've gone before and what they found helpful. Julia Selwyn who did some longitudinal research with families after adoption orders were made, found that the majority of children were still showing challenging behaviour in school. Now, how we define challenging behaviour is usually an adult definition. So what our children are probably showing is survival behaviour, but because school isn't really set up for children to express that insecurity, it becomes defined as challenging behaviour. And survival behaviour can be very challenging, but it's important to think about why children behave a particular way. Parents also commented that academic expectations of their children were low. This may come from a misunderstanding of why children aren't concentrating, as if it's because they're not academic, rather than that there are other things going on that are preventing them from learning. And we know that there's still very little input in teacher training around early complexity and developmental trauma. There were some adopted parents who had found educational professionals helpful, and within any group of adopters there's usually somebody who's got a teacher or member of staff who really understands their child. Young and Hartley did some research in 2018, noted that adopters found that being able to build a trusting relationship with a supportive professional was really helpful. There's growing evidence that when we meet a child's emotional needs, it has a positive effect on their learning capacity. If schools can reduce some of the things that place stress on a student, then the front part of the brain is more open to curiosity and learning. So by putting the things in place that help that child's emotional world feel safe and secure, we're also putting in place the appropriate strategies for that child to learn, develop, thrive and flourish. When we tune into children, we allow them to tune into learning.
For children who've had these kind of experiences of early trauma, they are often anxious and unable to relax. Their brain is operating at too high a stress level to settle to learn. Insecurity and difficulty building trusting relationships. Too many people have left them in the past, and school creates loss by changes of staff. We know this isn't intended to do harm, but for loss-sensitive children, it reinforces the message that people don't stay. Managing friendships and using appropriate social skills. Friendships involve a lot of reciprocity, and give and take is only available to people who aren't worried about their own safety and access to resources, whether they are emotional, social or physical. Coping with feelings. High stress makes us have bigger responses to things, so feelings can feel overwhelming and children will often explode because of the levels of stress they are experiencing. Coping with transitions and change. Children who have experienced absolute loss often have bodies that can't differentiate between big change, such as the loss of a family or person, and small change, such as the end of the day. Their bodies have the same fear response to any change, which can create unexpected behaviours. Managing behaviour. Very similar to above, their behaviour is an outlet for the overwhelming feelings. Learning and memory skills. A brain that is more preoccupied with survival doesn't have the space to think about numeracy problems, for example, so it doesn't retain that kind of information easily. Using executive functioning skills. Planning ahead for something that is stressful can bring the stress into the present, and lots of our children simply cannot remember all the things that are required of them, so offer help wherever possible. Feelings of not being valued or noticed. That worry that out of sight is out of mind, that sense of being held in mind by others when you're not in front of them, is very fragile in children who didn't get enough practice of that as babies and toddlers. Lack of awareness of senses. Children who weren't helped to understand their bodily and emotional states as infants carry that fragility with them. Consider getting advice around sensory input and sharing it with school. Equally, high stress levels make us less able to tolerate certain sensations, so if school is already a stressor, sensory struggles are likely to be higher.
Different attachment styles can produce different behaviours in the school setting. The anxious attachment style can look something like this. They need to remind you that they exist. Children who've experienced catastrophic losses in infancy can really struggle with the sense of a relationship existing outside of physical presence. They find times when their usual staff member is away much harder to manage. They can be preoccupied with relationships, might be disruptive to others. This is also linked to the above. If I always make sure you are thinking about me, then you can't forget me. It's a primitive need to ensure that the relationship continues. It's often with adults, but it can happen with peers too. Hypervigilant. Again, this relates to relationships and felt safety. If I know everything that is happening with everyone else, I can be prepared for anything that feels threatening to the relationships that keep me safe. Difficulty concentrating. If all my brain power is targeted at the above needs, all my concentration is going elsewhere. It's not that I can't concentrate, it's that what I need to concentrate isn't schoolwork. Struggles with consequences. Behaviour that operates from survival or fear will always take precedence. It's just that most of us don't feel as unsafe as often as children who've experienced developmental trauma do. So consequences seem unfair to someone who was operating from self-protection. Looking at the graphic on the slide, you can see just how much anxiety impacts on their physical state. For children whose bodies are spending so much energy in trying to cope with that level of anxiety, there really isn't much brain space left for learning, thinking, or self-reflection. That's why tending to emotional states first is so beneficial for the learning environment.
Avoidance attachments in school can look like this: withdrawn and quiet. They don't want to show a need for a relationship because then they can't be let down again. They are trying to avoid being seen. Struggles to ask for help. They can't ask for help because that involves being vulnerable to a relationship, which is too risky for them. Unforeseen outbursts. The stress of avoiding any form of interaction can be overwhelming, and eventually the body needs to get rid of that stress. A need to be in control. For any child who is terrified of the risks involved in relationships, they will endeavour to control all the eventualities so their expressed need for others is minimal. This can be incredibly challenging for parents and teaching staff because the whole learning system is based on the principle of practice. But for a child who needs to be in control, they cannot do that. It is way too much. Practice involves potential failure, and that involves needing to ask somebody for help, which is absolutely outside of their comfort zone.
And then we have disorganised attachments, which can look like the following in school. Controlling of others, very similar to the avoidance style. If I'm in control, I don't have to show my vulnerability to anyone else, and I can't be surprised by something unexpected. May show aggression. That overwhelming feeling of not being able to cope can often be expressed through explosive behaviour. May struggle with praise. If children have an internal sense of unworthiness, they find it difficult to hear someone saying something differently to what they feel. Feeling bad about themselves. Again, that sense of unworthiness can create a sense that they don't deserve anything good in their life. Fluctuating between anxious and avoidant attachment behaviours. The nature of a disorganised attachment is the disorganisation. The brain really doesn't know what works, so doesn't operate on a predictable pattern. It can sometimes look like an anxious attachment and sometimes look like an avoidant pattern. When looking at the quote on this slide, it's so easy to say, but it's important to try and remember that when children are overwhelmed by their emotions, what we want to do is try and bring them into our calm. We don't want to go into their chaos because that doesn't make them resolve their own conflict.
So what is an attachment and trauma-informed school? It's a school that understands the issues commonly experienced by adoptive families. So that might be because they've got lots of adopted children in the school, either now or in the past, or it might be because they've done training around it. It's a school that responds to each child's social, emotional and developmental needs and thinks in terms of skills needed. It's a school that prioritises relationships and emotional well-being. As we've said before, one of the things that research has clearly shown is that if you pay attention to a child's emotional needs, then the learning becomes much more available and effective. It's a school that responds empathically to behaviour. By recognising that behaviour tells us something about how somebody is feeling, we are more likely to be willing to think about that. That's not to say there will be no limits to behaviour, because there will need to be, but that there's real curiosity about what was happening for the child to cause the behaviour initially. Sets clear targets and monitors children's progress. Works in true partnership with parents. Senior leadership sets the tone for change. It is so helpful to have one member of staff supporting you, but it's a whole school ethos that really helps children feel safe in the school environment. Shares information sensitively and effectively. Uses resources wisely, can troubleshoot when interventions don't seem to work and supports staff. Learning is an ongoing process for everyone, and school needs to be open to reflecting and changing as well if things are not going well. By doing this, schools are actively trying to help children overcome their early barriers rather than ignoring them or punishing them for something they have no control over.
How can we help at the Centre for Adoption Support? Attachment and trauma training in set days. We can provide this in person or online and will be flexible to the school's needs. These are usually whole staff trainings. Reducing anxiety management plans, also known as RAMPs. These are meetings to consider the trauma history and its impact on a specific child. It should help home and school to pool knowledge around how to help the child stay in a calmer, safer state and therefore more able to learn. Education consultations. These can be about specific children or particular areas that a school want to think about. Training and support to implement therapeutic approaches such as sunshine circles, TheraPlay and Nurtured Heart. These can help schools to develop new skills to work more therapeutically with children. Belonging Together Assembly. This is to help children think about adoption as one of the many ways that families exist.
Universal financial support through Pupil Premium Plus. What is Pupil Premium Plus? PP Plus is additional educational funding given to schools for children who are looked after or in care, plus those children previously looked after. Funding for this cohort of children was originally covered by the Pupil Premium, but it was soon recognised that this group had additional needs due to gaps in learning and life experience impacting their ability to learn. PP Plus increased the funding for looked after children and came into effect in 2014. For the year 20 to 21 financial year, schools received £2,345 per eligible child. Who is eligible for PP Plus? It's available to pupils from reception age to year 11 in state-funded education in England who cover the following: are in local authority care in England, have been adopted from care in England or Wales, left care under a special guardianship order, left care under a child arrangements order, formerly a residence order. Pupils must be attending either a local authority maintained school or maintained special school, an academy or free school, a non-maintained special school, an independent school and other alternative provision, e.g. if they're home educated, where the place or provision is funded by the local authority. How is the money devolved and who decides how it is spent? PP Plus funding is provided by the Department of Education. It's for previously looked after children and is allocated directly to and managed by the school. And the onus is on the parent, carer or guardian of the child to make the school aware of the child's status. The school will not be aware of a child's adopted status unless you inform them. How PP Plus is spent is decided by the school, and it isn't automatically ring-fenced for individual pupils. Rather, the funding goes into a collective pot to be allocated in the ways the school feels would benefit this group of children. However, the school does need to be able to explain to the parents how the money is going to benefit your child and listen to your views on what would help.
Other areas of support. The virtual school. Each local authority has a virtual school, which is a group of educational professionals whose job it is to help children with additional needs achieve in their education. And they will have somebody in that team who supports adopted families with education. Their contact details will be available through Googling virtual school with the name of your local authority. Designated teachers. Your school will have what's called a designated teacher. This teacher should have lead responsibility for helping school staff understand the things which affect how looked after children learn and achieve. This information should be available on the school website, and if not, ask who the designated teacher is and introduce yourself. SENCO, or ANCO in Wales, is the Special Educational Needs Coordinator. A SENCO is a school teacher who is responsible for assessing, planning and monitoring the progress of children with special educational needs and disabilities, SEND. A really good SENCO will listen to parents and work with you and other staff in the school to ensure the right provision for your child. Again, this information will be available on the school website.